He was a boy without a father, a soldier who tasted defeat more than victory, a leader who could have been a king, but chose to be something greater. Bullets pierced his coat but never touched his body. Betrayal haunted him, yet he carried a nation on his shoulders. Twice he walked away from absolute power, and in doing so he became immortal. This is not the George Washington from your textbooks. This is the untold, unforgettable story of the man who built America. George Washington, the father of a nation, only on legacy biographies. Great stories often begin in the shadows of obscurity, in the quiet corners of history where no one is watching. But every so often, a figure emerges, someone whose very existence alters the fate of a nation, whose choices echo through centuries, and whose name becomes synonymous with freedom itself. For the United States of America, that figure was George Washington. We remember him as the first president, the man who led the colonies to victory, and the towering figure on the dollar bill. But behind the statues, behind the marble myths, lies a man of flesh and blood, a man who struggled, who failed, who doubted himself, and who carried the unbearable weight of destiny on his shoulders. And yet, he prevailed. The story of George Washington is not just a tale of battlefield triumphs or political power. It is a story of resilience, sacrifice, ambition, and a lifelong struggle to balance personal desire with the higher calling of history. And unless you watch his full story, you'll never truly understand why Washington was not merely a man, but the very foundation upon which a nation was built. A boy without a father. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. At first glance, his beginning seems unremarkable. He was not born into extreme wealth, nor into the depths of poverty. His father, Augustine, was a moderately successful tobacco planter, with ambitions of giving his children a better life. But fate struck early. When George was just 11 years old, his father died suddenly. For a boy that young, the loss was crushing. More than grief, it meant responsibility. The family was left in the hands of his mother, Mary, a stern and deeply religious woman who demanded discipline, but often offered little warmth. Unlike many of his peers from Virginia's elite, Washington was denied the chance of a full education in England. Instead, his schooling ended by the age of 15. He would forever feel the sting of this educational gap, especially when comparing himself to the refined, classically educated gentlemen around him. This insecurity never left him. To compensate, he developed a hunger for self-improvement, studying mathematics, surveying, military strategy, and above all, the art of leadership. Yet perhaps the most defining trait of young George was not what he possessed, but what he lacked. He lacked privilege, he lacked polish, he lacked inheritance. And in that absence, he developed something else. Ambition. The surveyor of dreams. At 16, Washington embarked on a career as a land surveyor. Now this may sound mundane, but in colonial Virginia, land was wealth, power, and prestige. Surveying was not just a job, it was a front-row seat to opportunity. The young Washington would trek through forests, rivers, and wilderness, charting the vast untamed frontier. Picture this, a teenager with little formal education, braving the harsh wilderness, sleeping under open skies, with nothing but his compass, chains, and determination. This was no classroom. This was survival, and it forged in him a toughness and independence that no aristocratic schooling ever could. By 17, Washington was appointed as the official surveyor of Culpeper County. He began acquiring land himself, planting the seeds of wealth that would one day make him one of Virginia's largest landowners. But land gave him more than fortune. It gave him vision. He saw the promise of America not as an abstract dream, but as soil beneath his feet. The shadow of Lawrence. George looked up to his half-brother Lawrence Washington more than anyone else. Lawrence was everything George aspired to be, polished, respected, and connected to Virginia's elite. Lawrence had served with distinction in the British military and even named his estate Mount Vernon after Admiral Edward Vernon, under whom he had served. George often visited Lawrence, absorbing not just the elegance of plantation life, but also the ideals of duty, honor, and service to the crown. For George, the British Army represented the pinnacle of glory. More than anything, he wanted to wear the red coat of a British officer. But destiny had a cruel way of shaping him through loss. Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis, and despite George's devoted care, even accompanying him to Barbados in search of a cure, Lawrence died in 1752. George was devastated, yet from this tragedy came inheritance. At just 20 years old, Washington assumed control of Mount Vernon. This was the turning point. A boy without a father was now the master of an estate. But responsibility weighed heavily, and Washington still yearned for something greater, honor on the battlefield. Baptism by fire. By his early 20s, Washington's ambition collided with history. The French and Indian War was brewing, and Virginia was at the center of conflict between the French, the British, and native tribes. In 1753, at just 21 years old, Washington was sent on a dangerous diplomatic mission by Virginia's governor, carrying a message to the French demanding they leave the Ohio Valley. The journey was treacherous: icy rivers, hostile territory, ambushes. At one point, he nearly drowned in a frozen river. At another, he barely escaped an assassin's bullet. But he completed the mission. The following year, Washington returned, not as a messenger but as a soldier. He led men into battle at Fort Necessity, where he built a crude stockade. It was here that Washington tasted both the thrill and the sting of command. In July 1754, he was forced to surrender to the French, the only time in his career he ever surrendered. Yet even in failure, Washington gained something invaluable: recognition. The world had seen him fight, and more importantly, Washington had seen himself bleed. The Braddock disaster. In 1755, Washington volunteered as aide-de-camp to British General Edward Braddock. Together, they marched into the wilderness with a massive army to seize Fort Duquesne. Washington was eager to prove himself worthy of a British officer's commission. But fate struck hard. The expedition ended in disaster. The French and their native allies ambushed Braddock's army, decimating them in what became known as the Battle of the Monongahela. Braddock was fatally wounded, chaos reigned, and it seemed the British would be annihilated. In that chaos, George Washington emerged. Calm under fire, he rallied the men, organized the retreat, and saved countless lives. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. 4 bullet holes pierced his coat, but not a single shot touched his body. Whispers spread. Washington was invincible. Some even believed he was protected by divine providence. Years later, native chiefs would tell him they had aimed directly at him, but the bullets seemed to bend away. The legend of Washington had begun. The frustration of ambition. Despite his bravery, Washington's dream of becoming a British officer was crushed. The Crown refused to grant colonial soldiers commissions in the regular army. To them, Americans were second class. For Washington, it was a wound of pride. He had risked his life for the empire, yet was treated as inferior. It was here, in the sting of rejection, that the seeds of revolution quietly took root in his heart. He didn't know it yet, but this humiliation was shaping the man who would one day defy the greatest empire on earth. For now, Washington returned to Virginia, hardened but restless. He expanded Mount Vernon, married the wealthy widow Martha Custis in 1759, and became one of the richest men in the colony. On the surface, life looked complete. Yet beneath the calm of plantation life, a storm was waiting. Because destiny was calling, and George Washington would soon answer in a way that would change history forever. The quiet before the storm. The years after the French and Indian War might have looked peaceful on the outside, but in truth, they were anything but. Washington was now a respected planter, a member of Virginia's House of Burgesses, and married to Martha Custis, one of the wealthiest widows in the colony. Together, they created a blended family, raising Martha's 2 children, and their Mount Vernon estate grew into a symbol of stability and prosperity. Yet Washington was not simply a farmer. His heart still longed for honor, for service, for something beyond the walls of his estate. And as tensions between the colonies and the British Crown began to rise, that longing would find its outlet. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts, and later the Tea Act, these were not just political quarrels for Washington. They were personal reminders of a deeper truth, that the British Empire, the same one that had denied him a commission, also denied the colonies the dignity of self-governance. He had seen firsthand how the Crown treated Americans as lesser subjects. Now he saw his fellow planters, farmers, and merchants being taxed without representation, treated as pawns in a distant game. Washington was not radical by nature. He did not thirst for rebellion like some of his contemporaries, but he did thirst for justice. Slowly, the loyal officer who once dreamed of serving the king began to shift toward the cause of independence. The reluctant revolutionary. By the 1770s, Washington was in his early 40s, a tall, commanding figure with a reputation for honesty and integrity. When the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, Washington attended in full military uniform. It was not a coincidence, it was a statement. He was not yet calling for independence, but he was ready for war. And when shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, history gave Washington the stage he had long prepared for. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress unanimously chose George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Think about that. A man who had once begged the British Crown for a commission, rejected and humiliated, now found himself holding the highest military command of a rebellion against that very crown. Destiny had come full circle. But here's the truth most people forget. Washington did not want this job. He knew the enormity of the task. He admitted to Congress that he felt unequal to the undertaking. He refused to take a salary, asking only for his expenses. This was not ambition. This was duty. And duty would cost him everything. A general without an army. When Washington took command in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he faced a nightmare. The so-called army was little more than a ragtag collection of militia, undisciplined, poorly equipped, short of food, and even shorter of gunpowder. Some soldiers had only one musket for 3 men, others had no shoes. Yet Washington believed discipline could forge them into soldiers. He drilled them, demanded order, and instilled a sense of unity. But more than drills, he gave them something they had lacked, a leader who looked the part of a commander. Washington's mere presence, tall, dignified, and unflinching, made men believe they could endure the impossible. The Siege of Boston. Washington's first great test came with the Siege of Boston. For nearly a year, his army surrounded the city, trapping British troops inside. But Washington lacked the artillery to drive them out, until a daring officer named Henry Knox hauled cannons from Fort Ticonderoga across frozen rivers and snowy mountains. With those guns placed on Dorchester Heights in March 1776, Washington forced the British to evacuate Boston without a full-scale battle. It was his first great triumph, but the victory was deceiving. Ahead lay failures that would nearly destroy the Revolution. The disaster of New York. In the summer of 1776, the British returned, not with a few thousand troops, but with the largest expeditionary force they had ever assembled. Ships darkened New York harbor. Tens of thousands of British soldiers and mercenaries prepared to crush the rebellion in one decisive blow. Washington positioned his army to defend New York, but he was outnumbered, outgunned, and inexperienced compared to Britain's generals. The result was catastrophic. At the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, Washington's army was nearly annihilated. Surrounded and outflanked, it seemed certain the revolution would end before it began. But then came one of the most miraculous escapes in history. Under the cover of night and a thick fog the next morning, Washington ferried his entire army across the East River to safety. Not a man was lost. The escape preserved the revolution. Still, the defeats kept coming. Harlem Heights, White Plains, Fort Washington. Loss after loss drove Washington's army into retreat across New Jersey. Soldiers deserted. Morale collapsed. Even Congress fled Philadelphia in fear. By December 1776, the revolution was hanging by a thread, the Christmas miracle. And then came the night that changed everything, December 25th, 1776. The Delaware River, freezing wind, sheets of ice, soldiers wrapped in rags, their feet bleeding on the frozen ground. Most armies would have surrendered. Washington did the opposite, he attacked. That night, he led his men across the icy river in a desperate gamble to strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton. At dawn, The ragged Continentals fell upon their enemy, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners with minimal losses. 1 week later, Washington struck again at Princeton. The victories were small compared to Britain's might, but psychologically they were massive. Washington had snatched the revolution from the jaws of death. The world began to believe again. The hard road of war. For the next several years, Washington endured a war that tested every ounce of his strength. He lost more battles than he won. He fought not just the British, but hunger, disease, mutiny, and the constant threat of desertion. Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-1778 was perhaps the darkest chapter. Nearly 2,500 men died from cold and starvation. Washington wrote bitterly to Congress about the lack of supplies, saying, "You might as well attempt to stop the winds as to stop the men from deserting without clothing." And yet, through all this suffering, Washington remained with his soldiers. He ate their meager rations. He walked among their tents. He shared their hardships. His presence alone gave them hope. When Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrived to drill the army, Washington supported him fully, turning ragged volunteers into disciplined troops. Out of misery, Washington forged steel, betrayal, and loyalty. But Washington's trials were not only on the battlefield. Politics and betrayal gnawed at him constantly. Some in Congress doubted his leadership. Rival generals plotted against him, hoping to replace him with others. Most famously, Benedict Arnold, a man Washington once trusted, turned traitor, conspiring to hand over West Point to the British. Washington's response to betrayal was not rage but resolve. He knew the revolution was bigger than his pride. When Arnold's treachery was revealed, Washington lamented, "Whom can we trust now?" But he pressed on. It was not only betrayal he faced, but loneliness. He spent years away from Mount Vernon, rarely seeing Martha. Letters between them revealed deep affection and sacrifice. Washington gave up personal happiness for the survival of a dream larger than himself. The turning tide. By 1781, the tide of war shifted. France had joined the American cause, bringing ships, supplies, and soldiers. Washington, who once led a starving army, now commanded an international coalition. That fall, he seized the moment for a decisive blow. Marching his forces south, he trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. With French naval support cutting off escape, Washington unleashed a relentless siege. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. Washington had done the impossible. A man who once begged for a British commission had now forced Britain to its knees. The United States was born. The temptation of power. But here lies one of the most extraordinary moments of Washington's life, not on the battlefield, but in what came after. With victory secured, many expected Washington to seize power, perhaps even crown himself king. His soldiers, unpaid and restless, hinted they might support such a move. The world had seen it before, generals turning into dictators. But Washington chose differently. In December 1783 in Annapolis, he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to Mount Vernon. Think of that moment. After 8 years of war, Washington held the power of a monarch, and he let it go. King George III, upon hearing the news, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And Washington did exactly that. He became the greatest not because he took power, but because he refused it. A fragile nation. Peace was not prosperity. The young United States was fragile, its government weak under the Articles of Confederation. States quarreled. Rebellions broke out, like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Many feared the revolution had been won in vain. The nation needed a unifying figure, someone trusted, respected, above faction. All eyes turned to Washington once more. In 1787, he reluctantly attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. His mere presence lent credibility to the effort, and when the delegates finished their work, they turned again to him. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. If you're enjoying this journey into the life of George Washington, don't forget to subscribe to Legacy Biographies, hit the like button, and share this video with others who love powerful life stories. Also, drop a comment. Tell us one fact you know about Washington that we didn't cover, or simply share how you felt about this video in just 1 or 2 lines. The reluctant president. When George Washington was elected in 1789, he was 57 years old, tired, weary, and longing for the quiet life at Mount Vernon. He had already given 8 years of his life to war. He had already walked away from absolute power once. But the nation had no alternative. The people trusted him above all others. Washington was the living embodiment of unity in a nation already fracturing into political factions. And so, with reluctance, he answered the call once more. When he took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789 in New York City, Washington's voice trembled with emotion. This was not a man drunk with ambition. This was a man burdened by duty. He later confessed, "I walk on untrodden ground." And indeed he did. Every decision he made would set precedent for centuries, building a nation from scratch. Think about the challenges. There was no blueprint for the presidency. The Constitution outlined powers in theory, but practice was another matter. Washington had to invent the role, step by step. He established the first cabinet, appointing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. Together, these men debated and clashed, shaping the first policies of a new government. Hamilton pushed for a strong national bank, Jefferson warned against centralized power, and Washington had to balance between them, always choosing unity over division. Even something as simple as how to address the president sparked controversy. Some suggested His Excellency, others His Highness. Washington rejected all grandeur, choosing instead the simple title, Mr. President. That decision alone spoke volumes. Washington was no king. He was a citizen serving his country, a man under siege. Yet the presidency was not glory. It was endless strain. Washington faced criticism from newspapers that painted him as a monarch in disguise. Political parties began to emerge, Federalists under Hamilton and Democratic Republicans under Jefferson, tearing at the unity he fought so hard to preserve. Foreign crises made matters worse. Britain and France resumed war in the 1790s, and both expected American loyalty. Washington insisted on neutrality, believing the fragile young nation could not survive another war. His proclamation of neutrality angered many, but he stood firm, guided not by popularity but by survival. At home, unrest boiled over. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion erupted in western Pennsylvania as farmers protested taxes on whiskey. Unlike Shays' rebellion years earlier, this time the government acted decisively. Washington, astonishingly, led troops into the field himself, the only sitting U.S. president to command soldiers in person. His presence ended the rebellion without major bloodshed. This moment proved a critical truth. The United States was not just an experiment on paper. It had teeth, it had order, it had a leader who would defend the rule of law. The personal burdens of power. Yet behind the strong facade, Washington was a man carrying immense personal burdens. He suffered from constant health problems, malaria, tuberculosis scars, dysentery, and terrible tooth decay that left him with painful dentures made of ivory, human teeth, and even animal bone. Contrary to myth, they were never wooden, but they were agonizing. He often spoke through pain, forcing himself to appear calm and controlled in public. Washington also struggled with slavery, a contradiction that still shadows his legacy. He owned hundreds of enslaved people at Mount Vernon, benefiting from their labor. Yet privately, he wrestled with the morality of it. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Washington made a quiet but profound decision. In his will, he ordered that all of his slaves be freed after his death. He was the only founding father to do so. It was a small step, but a powerful one, showing that even in the twilight of his life, Washington sought justice where once he had been blind. The farewell that defined a nation. By 1796, Washington was exhausted. 8 years as president had drained him. He longed for Mount Vernon, for quiet days away from politics and strife. And so he made another world-changing decision. He would not seek a third term. His farewell address remains one of the most important speeches in American history. In it, he warned against political parties, foreign entanglements, and the dangers of sectionalism. He urged Americans to see themselves not as Virginians or New Yorkers or Southerners or Northerners, but as one people. He reminded them that unity was the true foundation of liberty. These words, spoken more than 2 centuries ago, still echo today. When Washington left office in March 1797, he once again did what few in history had ever done. He walked away from power voluntarily. Twice in his life, he had surrendered absolute authority, first as a general, then as a president. And each time, he became greater not by what he took, but by what he gave up. The final chapter. Washington returned to Mount Vernon at last. He spent his final years overseeing the plantation, tending to his lands, and enjoying the company of Martha. He corresponded with friends, welcomed guests from around the world, and watched as the nation he had fathered slowly took root. But his health continued to decline. In December 1799, after riding through icy rain inspecting his estate, Washington developed a severe throat infection. Doctors bled him heavily, a common practice at the time, weakening him further. On the night of December 14, 1799, George Washington whispered his last words, "'Tis well." The father of a nation was gone. He was 67 years old. News spread like wildfire. The nation plunged into mourning. In cities and towns across America, people gathered in silence, bells tolled, and sermons were preached. Even in Europe, leaders bowed in respect. Napoleon ordered a 10-day mourning period in France. The world had lost not just a leader, but a legend, the legacy that endures. Why does George Washington matter today? Why does his story still echo across centuries? It is not because he was flawless. He was not. He made mistakes, he held contradictions, he battled insecurities and doubts. It is because, in the moments when history demanded greatness, Washington rose to meet it. He fought when defeat seemed certain. He endured when all others despaired. He gave up power when he could have seized it. He lived not for himself, but for something greater. He showed the world that liberty could be defended not by kings or tyrants, but by ordinary men who dared to lead. Washington was not born a legend. He became one, through struggle, sacrifice, and choices that defined a nation. Imagine this: a boy who lost his father at 11, a teenager who wandered the wilderness with a surveyor's chain, a young man humiliated by rejection, a general defeated in battle after battle, a leader betrayed by his own men, and yet, from those ashes rose the father of a nation. When America had no army, he built one. When it had no hope, he gave it back. When it had no government, he shaped it. And when it had no precedent, he became one. George Washington was more than the first president. He was the proof that a republic could survive, that freedom could endure, that power could serve people, not enslave them. His life was not about crowns or thrones. It was about something far greater. It was about the birth of a nation. And so, more than 2 centuries later, we remember him not just as a man on a monument, not just as a face on a dollar bill, but as the living heartbeat of America's beginning. George Washington, the father of a nation,